David Gonski is a very eloquent man for a banker, and is, of course, a beloved Chancellor, and so I address him first, and distinguished academic staff and guests. I would like to thank the university for educating both my daughter Jane and my son-in-law Craig, who are travelling well some years after graduation. And I would like to celebrate the fact that this university has always been a place to meet extraordinary people. I've met both Gerry Adams here and the peace-spreading President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, one of my heroines. The distinguished fingerprints of Professor Donald, the Dean, and of Professor Ronan MacDonald, of the Director of the Global Irish Studies Centre of this university, are all over this doctorate. It's a put-up job. And if I give a silly speech, Chancellor Gonski, I think it should reflect badly on them. I'm fortunate to be in your company, since you are the true people of this day, and what happens today will never leave you or fail to influence the rest of us, actually. And I'd like to suggest to the doctoral students that many a thesis makes a great book. And perhaps you could try Oxford University Press or Harvard University Press, but if your thesis is really good, take it to University of New South Wales Press. I now know that you want to get out into the night and take each other by the hands, as you should, embrace each other, receive the applause of your families, and maybe more kisses than are totally necessary from your mother. But the rule of getting a degree is that, not content with what they've inflicted on you to this point, before you can go out and enjoy yourself, you have to listen to some older person give you a stint of advice or information you're probably not in the mood to hear. And as I ever say at these events, you've heard of the soup du jour. Well, I'm the boring old bloke du jour. Nevertheless, it's true that in the light of Joe Hockey's imputation that the aged amongst the leaners of our society and not the lifters, I might be welcome in that I'm still working at 79, hoping to be working until my last breath, and am, by courtesy of the wonderful business of writing into which I blundered in the early 1960s, not a pensioner. So hooray, Joe, and call the youngsters off me. I live off a publishing industry which, like most industries you will enter, is in revolution. It's harder for me though, because I began school in 1941 in a country town in New South Wales using a slate and a slate pencil, and thus I'm a Stone Age human. You clearly are not, and many of you have masters, baccalaureates and doctorates to prove you're not. But my Neolithic condition, and reflecting back on it, gives me room to ponder why there are so many human institutions still existing, even though there's no technological reason for them to do so. I'd better have this water now, since I've been... It astonishes me how well the old-fashioned print book has survived, the Gutenberg-style book. Even though it's perfectly possible to publish online, now the coolest young writers still want to be published in the Gutenberg form. And I think because that physicality is a confirmation of their talent. And I think it's also because we are still tactile animals, and we like the mixture of the e-book and its huge benefits, particularly in research, but also the experience of measuring our way through an artefact of paper and inks. And after all, we have no technological use for cinemas either. I mean, Netflix it could serve all our wants, at least theoretically. And yet we go to cinemas because we're social animals, and as Aristotle said, we are homo risibilus, laughing man. We like to laugh and be scared in a pack. There's similarly no technological reason why universities shouldn't be entirely virtual, but you preferred that if you go to tertiary studies, it should still be in a physical institution, one you walk through to establish a set of rich social and intellectual contacts, a physical experience as well as an intellectual one. To labour the point, of course, as a rugby league hoon, I realise we don't need stadia either. We could, technologically, we could play all the games in a studio with a computer-generated crowd. The way Manly and Parramatta are travelling, it would be a mercy if we did it. Except that we're tribal, and we have tribal colours we wish to exhibit and weep over at full time. So technology can't change the creatures we always were. Each of us remains a peculiar kind of gifted animal, an angel. Since our brain volume increased and our voice boxes evolved, at a period of prehistory no one can decide upon, a matter of dispute 10,000 years ago, 30,000, 60,000, but since it happened we've become the masters, the kings and queens of language. There is a wonderful theory that language began with young mothers putting their babies down because through lack of fur they had no capacity to carry them continuously while they worked, and they had to do the cooking, of course. And thus language began as a mode of reassurance to the baby that having been put down it would be picked up again. I like that fable. A form of motherese might have been the first language, whereas writing, we know from Jared Diamond, it began in the most boring way as a matter of recording tax collections. And it took about 800 years for the first love poem to be written. But motherese is a mode of language that is in its way a love poem. In any case, however our language began, I'm grateful for having had a wonderful life being a sort of valet or gardener of language. And like many other and better writers, I've made stories of love and animosity towards the despised people of the earth. That's a story that novelists seem to like to tell. You know, they urge us, writers, to be nice to each other, but in fact, if we were uniformly nice to each other, there'd be no art. And of course, if every love affair went smoothly, there'd be no poetry. But that's a conundrum that I'll leave hanging in the air. We like to talk about people stuck on racial, religious and cultural fault lines. As an Australian redneck, I was always engrossed in the question of why there's always been so much hate in Europe and why it's still found there, all crammed into such a small space. Since my father was an Australian soldier in North Africa and regularly sent me home what I saw as an asthmatic 7-year-old as souvenirs, Germans, corporal stripes, Nazi pistol holsters, very pistols and other items. I was always enthralled in Homebush, New South Wales, not the most exciting place in the hemisphere, always enthralled by the way European hatred emerged in World War II, stoked by that terrible demagogue and his allies. Let me say that writers don't use this sort of material about racial hysteria and conflict because we're noble people. Most of us are terrible to live with, and my wife has said she's willing to give interviews on the matter in the lobby after this. We write about race and other divisions because that's where the high drama is. I've been fascinated by racial division ever since as a little kid in a country town in white Australia of the early 1940s. I saw Aboriginals from the local Green Hill settlement walk past our gate in Kempsey. These people were the tribe to which Greg Inglis, the great South Sydney centre three-quarter belongs, who somehow mysteriously plays for Queensland, but that's a small mystery compared to whether Motherese was our first language. I saw these Aboriginals. It wasn't a moral fascination because I wasn't a very bright kid. I could show you the school reports that made my mother weep, but I could tell in a primitive, intrigued way that these were a people bewildered by loss of land, loss of validity as a people, loss of culture, and that having had misery imposed on them, they were being blamed for being unable to escape it. And what a tribute it will be to our community when soon, with the support of all parties, we acknowledge that ancient culture and those towering millennia of occupation of Australia before settlement in our Constitution, as has been proposed by the PM and the Leader of the Opposition. That will bring about the employment of language, of the ultimate Motherese, to make peace with ourselves. However, I cannot hope in obvious futility. I hope sometimes, and because of my love of language, which is still the most wonderful daily power tool that never needs a battery recharge, that I might see the departure from our national discourse of some of the more outrageous and willful misuses of English language with whom in both major parties with which the Australian polity is afflicted. I'm not the first to mention this. Visiting Professor Paul Keating of this university had an advisor called Don Watson, who's become a brilliant writer, and wrote, by the way, his doctoral thesis was published and is still in print, and it's a ripper. It's called Caledonia Australis. It's a history thesis. But Don Watson wrote a bestseller about weasel words. But there's the misuse of the English language to blunt its humanity. But there's a further twist. Our leaders are not only so often misusers of language, but sometimes they're deniers of our access to its better angels and its more humane colorations. An example of what I think of as misuse. Now, I know a young writer, Mark Isaacs, who was working on Nauru at a time when inmates were looking forward to a visit by the Labor government immigration minister, Chris Bowen. Knowing the desperate hopes that were harboured by fellow human beings of different races in the tents and huts of Nauru, Mark Isaacs was disheartened when he heard an aide to the minister refer to the people they'd come to deal with as the undesirables. Now, the refugee problem is hugely inconvenient for the world, though Western governments sometimes help create it by our foreign policies, and tyrants account for the bulk of the horror. The refugee problem is a puzzle for the world, a test of policy and a test of compassion. And there's the undeniable further problem of the criminality in some cases and the brutality in others, and indeed the poverty of the people smugglers. And there's a problem in the terrible perils of drowning for those who believe we are a beacon they must reach. A belief, by the way, we should indeed gratefully celebrate the fact that we have in the world a repute as being a fine place to live, to be human, and to speak our motherese. But I ask, does any group of humans who have committed no crime deserve to be verbal like that as opening gambit on an enormous world refugee problem by the representative of a party, admittedly not the minister, which has always declared its solidarity with the rest of us, descendants of the one African mitochondrial Eve as we are? Why do we have to pre-kill them with words even before we confront them? What are we trying to justify? Well, I can set an alternate scene, if you'll forgive me. Recently, an Australian journalist took a camera crew aboard an Italian search aircraft looking for survivors amongst the vessels plying between North Africa and the Italian island of Lampedusa, which is way out there, halfway between Tunisia and Italy itself. But it's an Italian resort, and it's now become something of a graveyard. By the way, there and elsewhere in Italy, 40 times the number of vessels that have landed on our north coast have come ashore. And even before the turn back the boats policy, the numbers of boats, the comparison was very high by comparison with Australia. And last weekend, for example, nearly 6,000 asylum seekers, some of them from Eritrea, which is I used to go there with an honorary doctorate of this university, a famous man called Fred Hollows. Nearly 6,000 asylum seekers were rescued, many of them Eritreans and Syrians, and landed at Augusta in Sicily. Italy stresses rescue over prohibition, and the wisdom of doing so is hotly debated, though the chief of the Italian Navy went on the record to express doubts that turning the boats back is feasible in the Mediterranean. Back to the Australian journalist then in Lampedusa. He got aboard a rescue plane, and he asked a member of the aircrew about the exhaustion of looking through sectors of sea for boats and survivors. The crew member said it was a wearisome search, as it is. That's an honest answer. But then he went on to say, one is always to remember they are human beings down there. This is a scene which I'm sad is not permitted to occur in an Australian context. An Australian journalist would be unable to get aboard an Australian search plane. He would be unable to ask Defence Forces what they think, even though we know our Defence young men and women possess the same honourable impulses as the Italian crew member. I cherish the fact that I have an inherited right to say this tonight without fear of arrest, facing no greater sanction than being considered dewy-eyed or a silly old coot. I do not say I have an answer to the refugee problem, though I will sketch out a possible broad one derived from wise sources. I just know that what we're doing, verbally and in other ways, is not the answer, and that using language to position our more baleful and lower instincts is not the answer. I'm even a little uneasy with the rhetoric of lifters and leaners. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think that oversimplifies and unreliably defines a society where, for example, more and more impaired young people survive the most terrible road crashes, in which there's such high unemployment, which is a phenomenon I hope all you graduates tonight escape. If you ever get a job knocked back, just tell them Chancellor Gonski will be around to see them. More and more impaired young people then surviving accidents and suffering from high unemployment, and in which the aged seek some return from the community for which they've worked for so long. Most humans want to be lifters, thank God, and after the last current affair has chased down the last welfare rorter, there will still be citizens with no choice but to turn to the rest of us. The insinuation behind the lifter-leaner rhetoric is capable of being used to divide us, making the young, the fit, the Australians blessed with fruitful employment, the heroes and white hats of our great Australian Western, and implying that the aged and the disabled are somehow parasitic. When you look at it, lifters and leaners is not a long way removed from George Orwell's Animal Farm, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. Besides that, the intergenerational report does not declare a necessary war of disentitlement for my fellow aged. It declares, in fact, that age and service pensions are currently equal to 2.9% of GDP. In the proposed policy scenario, admittedly as proposed in last year's budget and including a means test, which is fair enough, this is projected to stand at 2.7% of GDP in 2054 and 55, when you'll all be middle-aged. I hope you're still lively and taking selfies and all the rest of it. This is projected to stand at 2.7% of GDP in 2054-55, when real income per person will be much higher. Real income will be higher. That doesn't sound to me like the basis of an ideological war on grannies. Why do I interrupt your night of joy with a contentious issue like this? I do apologise. The big news of the day is your arrival on the scene, and let's keep it that way. But we in Australia have reacted to a genuine world crisis with verbal meanness and subsequent cruelty. The Italians have reacted with a reckless and, according to many, ill-advised humanity that may in the end cause us all to look at the disease instead, to wake up and look at the disease instead of persecuting the symptoms as we are now. And of course, we believe that we're uniquely being picked on by these people, but in fact, in the first 7 months of 2014, Italy received 87,000 boat people, and of course, as I said, 6,000 last weekend, which they processed under the system called Mare Nostrum, without imprisonment, but by prompt processing. I wish devoutly that instead of pressing the English language into its more brutal gears and scapegoating victims, instead of enlisting our support and policies that are cruel and that win applause overseas only from the extreme right wing, we too could address ourselves not to international denial, but to an international solution. After World War II, when I was a charming brown-haired, if you can believe it, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, Chifley was approached by a wonderful Australian logistics expert and UN official called Sir Robert Jackson. He's my nominee for the great unsung Australian hero. He worked for UNRWA. He had 8 million people in camps in Europe who had no papers, which is considered a sin these days, who had no papers. Before you flee the tyrant, you're supposed to duck down to the government offices and get papers signed by him, obviously. But in any case, they had no documents, and he came to Ben Chifley and said, I want you to take 100,000. Ben Chifley took 170,000. Jackson said he was able to use the fact that Australia took 170,000 to lever other countries into solving this problem and placing the 8 million refugees, which is the number of refugees presently accredited by the UN throughout the Western world. This is what we should be trying to do instead of prohibition. For the engines of tyranny continue to run hot everywhere, and the tide is not going to stop. So we have to secure our borders, stop the drownings, but when people arrive, anyhow, driven by tyrannies we cannot imagine, and which we would react to as they have reacted to, what is the sense of beginning with insults? I was astounded to read about Malcolm Fraser fighting to admit the Vietnamese, and in an election facing down the Labour Party, and led by Gough Whitlam, facing them down about the refugee issue in 1977-78. Whitlam, to his credit, then having tried to win an election by creating alarm, amongst other issues, creating alarm over Vietnamese refugees, he then decided that he couldn't pursue this racial bashing any further, and so the policy became bipartisan, as we wish things would happen now. I'd just like you to, having written so many books on race, I'd like you, as you go forth into your life, when you hear a particular group demeaned in language, you have to ask yourself, what are they trying to hide? Why are they directing our attention there instead of to more substantive issues? Are our taxes being validly used to pursue this hateful policy? And are we in fact victimizing ourselves to pay for our racial hysteria? We should be suspicious of frenzy as Oskar Schindler was suspicious of Nazi ideology, because sometimes when a group is scapegoated, it means that leaders may be distracting us from some more important issue, like a conjurer who makes us concentrate on his right hand as he performs a trick with his left. But enough of that. Our history has proven gratefully, and it's a great history, that the them who was suspected when I was a kid have become the us. That the them who was suspected by Pauline Hanson have become the us. There's a great lesson in that, the way racial hysteria grazes, does damage, but hopefully does not win the day. And so this brief purgatory of a speech ends, and now comes your rejoicing. You've earned your imminent joy at your success. The boredom is over. I hope my earnestness hasn't detracted from your triumph in the slightest, because the most important thing tonight is that you go out there and that you celebrate now, and that then you go out into the further community. And there, I'm sure, you'll be absolutely marvellous citizens and servants of humanity. And there is a new Australia to be made, and in it, I am sure, you will shine. Thank you.